We're back to the Catholic Challenge. I'm your host, Luke Lancaster. Going through more evidence for the deuterocanonical books. 7 books. Only Catholics have, Protestants do not. We're looking at history, church history, how the earliest Christians utilized these books. Look at another one. Right after seeing Irenaeus, now we're looking at Tertullian. He's from Africa. Irenaeus, the previous guy, was from France, Lyon. Now we're looking at Africa. Tertullian, writing around 197 AD, early Christian leader, he writes, quote, "For when one reads of God as being the searcher and witness of the heart," that's quoting from Wisdom, yet again, deuterocanonical book, only in Catholic Bibles, "when his prophet is reproved by his discovering to him the secrets of the heart, when God himself anticipates in his people the thoughts of their heart, why think ye evil in your hearts?" It's from Matthew's Gospel. When David prays, "Create in me a clean heart, O God," it's from Psalm 51. And Paul declares, "With the heart man believeth unto righteousness," that's from Romans. And John says, "By his own heart is each man condemned," that's 1 John 3. When, lastly, he who looketh on a woman so as to lust after her hath already committed adultery with her in his heart. It's Matthew's Gospel. Then both points are cleared fully up, that there is a directing faculty of the soul. Right, so this is Tertullian, his writing called On the Soul, and he quotes all these biblical books, and of course the Book of Wisdom. Only Catholics have it. It's thrown right in there because it's just assumed that you acknowledge that as sacred scripture. Yet millions of people do not acknowledge it as sacred scripture, so that's a sad reality, and they need to get into history. All right, this one now, an early Christian canon of Scripture. This is called the Muratorian Fragment. This fragment lists the books that are in fact canonical, the books that belong in the Bible. And of course, what does it list? The Epistle of Jude, indeed, and 2 belonging to the above-named John, or bearing the name of John, are reckoned among the Catholic epistles. And the Book of Wisdom, written by the friends of Solomon in his honor. Close quote. Right, Wisdom, deuterocanonical book. Just assume that you acknowledge that as Scripture. Next one is the Early Christian Council of Rome. This is a local council amongst many of the church leadership in 382 AD. The decree of Pope Damasus at that council says the books that are in fact biblical. And what does it list? Of course, the deuterocanonical books. It says, quote, "The order of the Old Testament begins here: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, then Joshua, Judges, Ruth, Kings, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, Chronicles, the Psalms." And then, of course, look at that. Solomon, 3 books: Proverbs, Ecclesiastes, the book of Canticles. Likewise, Wisdom and Sirach, Ecclesiasticus, Sirach. Those are books only found in the Catholic Bible, right? Wisdom and Sirach. Likewise, the order of the prophets: Isaiah, Jeremiah, Lamentations, Ezekiel, Daniel, Hosea, Nahum, Habakkuk, and of course they list a bunch of other ones. Skip down a little bit longer. Likewise, the order of the historical books: Job, Tobit, only Catholics have that, Esdras, which is Ezra and Nehemiah, Esther, Judith, and Maccabees, the 2 books of Maccabees. Right? Those 2 books of Maccabees and Judith and Tobit, those are deuterocanonical books that Catholics have. And here it is, plain as day, 382 AD. That's where they said is scriptural. Now, the next guy I want to look at is St. Jerome. A lot of Protestant Christians will say that St. Jerome held that the deuterocanonical books were not scripture. This is in fact false. All right, check out the slide here. It says, Jerome at times seems to have contradicted himself on the nature of the deuterocanonicals, yet he translated them as scripture in his Latin Vulgate translation. Right, so if St. Jerome actually thought that the deuterocanonicals were not scripture, why did he translate them and put them into the Bible? It's because he thought they were biblical books. He also explicitly quoted them as scripture. St. Jerome says, quote, "Does not the scripture say, burden not thyself above thy power?" Now, he just explicitly called the book of Sirach scripture. Right? You can read about that in Jerome's work to Eustochium, Epistle 108, written about 404 AD. Now another big guy, Augustine of Hippo. Many people love this man because he was an excellent bishop. He wrote numerous theological works. And why don't you listen to St. Augustine on the canon? It says, quote, "Now the whole canon of Scripture, on which we say this judgment is to be exercised, is contained in the following books." I'm just summarizing them. 5 books of Moses, Job and Tobias, right? Tobias there, Esther, Judith, and the 2 books of Maccabees, one called Wisdom and the other Ecclesiasticus, Sirach. They are to be reckoned among the prophetical books, since they have obtained recognition as being authoritative. Right? These are authoritative books that are included in the whole canon of Scripture, as he says in his work on Christian doctrine, section 2, verse 8, written about 426 AD. Augustine thinks that the deuterocanonical books are Scripture. Now, some people will try to emphasize, but didn't the Jewish people reject those 7 extra books, those deuterocanonical books? Well, when they say this, frequently they're appealing to this Council of Jamnia, which they claim happened at about 90 AD, and they claim that the Jewish people at that council rejected those 7 deuterocanonical books that we just gave a mountain of evidence showing that they are Scripture. However, according to Dr. Brant Petrie, that Council of Jamnia by the Jews is totally mythical, for there is 0 evidence for the Council of Jamnia. In fact, if you look at the early Jewish rabbis, they're still debating what is canonical, what books are belonging to the Scriptures or not belonging to the Scriptures. They do that centuries after Jesus in the Talmud. The Talmud has collections of all the rabbinical debates, the Jewish rabbis and their debates. They're still debating it for centuries after Jesus. There is no official Council of Jamnia that says that the Old Testament books do not have the deuterocanonical books, those 7 extra books added in. Right? They'll also say, well, Jews today, they don't hold to these 7 extra books, so, we as Protestants aren't going to hold those 7 extra books. That also isn't a good argument, right? As we saw, the canon was not closed for centuries after Jesus existed. And the Jewish people don't have any authority after Jesus leaves. Jesus gave us 12 men, and those 12 men ordained successors, and so we follow the successors of the apostles. We're not going to follow Jewish people who centuries afterwards decide to get rid of the deuterocanonicals. They did get rid of them, however, they were still debating it for centuries after Jesus. Right? In fact, if you look in the Talmud quotes Sirach chapter 9, verse 35, I would argue with Scripture in Tractate Baba Kama, section 92b. Another man refers to these rabbinical debates. His name is Lawrence Schiffman from the Yeshiva University. He says, quote, "While virtually all the writings were regarded as canonical by the time of the destruction of the temple in 70 AD or Common Era CE, arguments continued regarding the status of Proverbs, Song of Songs, Ecclesiastes, and Esther. And these disputes are attested in rabbinic literature. Second Temple literature indicates that a collection of writings existed as early as the 2nd century BC, but was not regarded as formally closed." Right? So the Jewish people did not have a closed canon that excluded the deuterocanonical books. No, even books that they are now in their canon. Right? Proverbs, that's a book that's in the Jewish canon. They were debating it, and they were debating it for centuries. Right? So to claim that the Jews didn't accept these books, these 7 deuterocanonical books, it's just not a good argument. Now, what I mentioned at the beginning, how these 7 deuterocanonical books, they weren't originally written in Hebrew. Right? So people will say, well, deuterocanonicals, 2nd canon, deutero, 2nd canon, canonicals, these deuterocanonical books from the Old Testament, they weren't originally written in Hebrew, so we have to reject them. Well, actually, why do you claim that when the book of Daniel, which Protestant Christians will consider to be inspired, Daniel, portions of it is written in Aramaic. How can you claim that you only accept books written in Hebrew when you are also accepting a book that's not written in Hebrew? That's the book of Daniel. That's written portions in Aramaic. So there's a double standard there. This argument is honestly not a good one again. And plus, I'd also emphasize the Dead Sea Scrolls found recently around 50, 70 years ago. They found numerous scrolls dating to all the way back to like the 2nd century BC, 1st century BC, 1st century AD. These writings, they actually found that some of these books, the deuterocanonical books, which it was assumed that they were written in Greek, in reality, there are Hebrew and Aramaic copies of these deuterocanonical books. For example, Tobit and Sirach. Those books only Catholics have. Those books, we found copies of them not written in Greek, but also Hebrew and Aramaic. So to claim you only accept books written in Hebrew, again, terrible argument there, because we have copies of Tobit and Sirach that seem to suggest that they might have originally been written in Hebrew and Aramaic as well. All right. Now I want to just give a brief overview of the canon of Scripture. How did we get the scriptural canon? What books belong in the Bible? The Bible has a table of contents, but who formally organized that table of contents? Let's look at there. The Synod of Rome in 382 listed the deuterocanonical books as canonical. Right? The Synod of Rome, we quoted that earlier. The Regional Council of Hippo in 393 AD, those also listed those 7 books. The Regional Council of Carthage in 397 listed those deuterocanonical books. The Second Council of Nicaea in 787 listed the deuterocanonical books. The Council of Florence from 1434 to 1445, that 11-year council, listed the deuterocanonical books. And finally, the Council of Trent from 1545 to 1563 infallibly defined that the deuterocanonical books are scriptural books. These 7 books that Catholics have, we didn't add them in. They were original. Protestant Christians threw them out, unfortunately. All right, so the sources for this presentation is the book The Case for the Deuterocanonicals by Gary Michuta. He also wrote a book called Why Catholic Bibles Are Bigger. I also consulted various scriptural professors and a website written by a former Protestant, John Salza. His website, scripturecatholic.com. Also, you can look that up. I also throw in there, look up churchfathers.com, or it might be churchfathers.org. That lists all of these early Christians and what they have to say about the Deuterocanon. All right, so I appreciate your time with me. Read the deuterocanonical books. Check out my website, stpeterinstitute.com, stpeterinstitute.com. And I'll see you next week. Grace and peace.